The gun went off before anyone in the room had time to breathe. Minjun didn't flinch. He just turned slowly, adjusted his cufflink, and looked at the man slumped against the wall like he had simply dropped something inconvenient. The warehouse in Incheon smelled like salt water and fear, and every man standing in that room knew that the only reason they were still breathing was because Minjun Kwon had not yet decided otherwise. He was 34 years old, he ran the most powerful criminal organization in South Korea, and he had never once in his adult life lost control of a room. But that was before Atlanta. That was before her. And right now, 3 years later, with a diamond ring in his left pocket and an old simple band in his right, Minjun was standing in front of a mirror in a Seoul penthouse wondering how a man could be so powerful and still feel like he had lost the only thing that ever mattered. Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because this one right here is going to have you feeling everything. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now because we post stories like this every week. Now let's get into it. 3 years before that night in Seoul, Minjun Kwon arrived in Atlanta on what was supposed to be a 2-week business trip. The Kwon organization was expanding into East Coast logistics, which was a clean way of saying they were buying warehouses, moving money through them, and making sure nobody asked too many questions. He had done this kind of setup a dozen times across a dozen cities. Atlanta was supposed to be no different. Then he walked into a courthouse on a Tuesday morning for a routine meeting and sat down in a waiting room, and a woman walked in and sat across from him and opened a case file without even glancing in his direction. He noticed her immediately. It was hard not to. She had the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but collected it anyway. She was dressed simply, hair pulled back, reading glasses on, and she was completely unbothered by the fact that he was staring. After about 4 minutes, without looking up from her file, she said, "Whatever you are trying to figure out about me, you can just ask." He almost smiled. Almost. "I was not trying to figure anything out. You were staring. I was thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that you walked into a room full of dangerous men and sat down like you were waiting for a bus." She looked up then. Her eyes met his and did not move. "I am a criminal defense attorney. I have sat across from dangerous men my entire career." She tilted her head slightly. "You are going to have to be more specific about what makes you different." That was the moment. He felt it and said nothing. Her name was Seoul, 28 years old, 3 years into her career, already handling cases that partners twice her age avoided. She represented a man connected loosely to Minjun's Atlanta operation, which meant they kept crossing paths in waiting rooms and courthouse corridors over the next 2 weeks. Minjun postponed his return to Seoul once. Then again. His second in command, a sharp, quiet man named Do-hyun, said nothing, but his silence said everything. The thing about Seoul was that she never tried to understand him. She never asked probing questions or tried to decode him. She just existed around him with a kind of ease that he had never experienced from anyone. She laughed at things that were actually funny and did not laugh at things that were not. She ate seriously like food deserved full attention. She argued with him about small things and dropped big things like they were not worth the energy. One night, about 6 weeks in, he was in the kitchen of the apartment he had rented when she came by unannounced and found him cooking. He had not told her he cooked. He barely told anyone. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him, then walked to the counter and sat on it and said, "Okay, what are we eating?" Like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked at her for a second. Then he handed her a spoon to taste the broth and said nothing, and she tasted it and closed her eyes and said, "You add ginger last, don't you?" "How did you know that?" "Because the flavor is still bright. If you added it earlier, it would be deeper." She handed the spoon back. "My grandmother did the same thing." He stood there looking at her, and something in his chest shifted in a way he could not name and did not try to. 3 months later, he told her the truth about who he was. Not everything, but enough. They were at dinner, a quiet place she liked, and she asked him a single question in a very calm voice, and the truth came out of him before he had decided to give it. She sat with it for a long time. Then she said, "I am not going to pretend that doesn't scare me, because it does. But I am also not going to pretend I haven't already decided that I want to be around you, because I have. So what are we supposed to do with both of those things?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Okay, let's figure it out." They got married 5 months after that. Courthouse, a Tuesday, just the two of them and her best friend Nadia as witness and a stranger they pulled off the street for the second signature. The rings were simple. The ceremony was 4 minutes long. Afterwards they ate jollof rice at Nadia's apartment and argued cheerfully about whether the Scotch bonnet was too much, and it was the best night of Minjun's life. He did not tell his family. He told himself he was waiting for the right time. The truth, which he would only admit to himself much later, was that he already knew his family would not accept her, and he was not yet ready to face what that meant. He was happy. For the first time in a very long time he was simply, quietly, fully happy. And happiness, he was about to learn, was the most dangerous thing a man in his position could allow himself. The call from Seoul came on a Wednesday night at 2 in the morning. He stepped onto the balcony to take it. Soleil was asleep inside. He stood out there in the Atlanta air for 11 minutes, listening, saying very little, and when he came back inside he stood at the edge of the bedroom and looked at her sleeping and stayed there for a long time. He made coffee at 5. She woke up at 6 and found him already dressed and said, "You're up early." Couldn't sleep. She looked at him the way she always did when she knew something was wrong but was giving him space to say it himself. He almost told her then. He almost said everything. Instead he poured her coffee and said, "Go back to sleep. I have an early call." She watched him for a moment. Then she took the coffee and said, "Okay, come back to bed after." "Yes," he said. It was the last lie he ever told her. He was on a plane to Seoul by noon. He did not pack much. He did not leave a note. He told himself he would explain everything once he figured out how to fix it, once he found a way to handle his father and come back to her safely. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things at 30,000 feet that he almost believed. Do-hyun met him at Incheon Airport and said nothing about the fact that Min-jun had left a wife behind in Atlanta. He simply took the bag and walked ahead, and Min-jun followed, and that was how it began. The meeting with his father happened the next evening. Chairman Kwon Dae-sung was 62 years old and had built the Kwon Empire from a single shipping container and 30 years of ruthless decision-making. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He sat at the head of a long dinner table and cut his food with the precision of a man who controlled everything in his immediate environment, which was always everything. He slid a photograph across the table without looking up. It was Soleil. Getting coffee. Taken yesterday. In Atlanta. Min-jun looked at the photo and said nothing. His father said, "She's lovely," and took a bite of his fish, still not looking up. "It would be a terrible thing," his father continued quietly, "if something disrupted the life she has built for herself. A young woman with that kind of career ahead of her. A shame to see that interrupted." Min-jun kept his voice completely flat. "Nothing is going to happen to her." His father looked up then. Just briefly. Just long enough. "No," he said. "It isn't. Because you are going to handle this correctly." That was the entire conversation. No shouting. No threats spelled out directly. Just a photograph and a quiet dinner and a message so clear it didn't need volume. 2 days later, 2 of his father's men found Min-jun alone in his office and delivered the reminder that the terms were permanent. He did not fight back. He stood there and took it and said nothing because fighting back would have made it worse, and making it worse meant Atlanta. He had a scar along his ribs after that. For inches. Clean. Unhurried. The kind of mark that was meant to be remembered, not survived. He tried once, in the weeks after, to find a way to reach her safely. A message through a third party that could not be traced back to him. Something. Anything. Every channel he found had his father's eyes somewhere in it. Every option he created put her closer to danger. He sat with that for a long time, and then he stopped trying. Not because he stopped caring, but because caring was exactly the thing that made her a target. He told himself she would move on. He told himself she was better off not knowing. He told himself she was young and brilliant and would build something extraordinary without him in it. He told himself all of that, and then he went to sleep every night holding on to the one thing he could not let go of, which was the memory of a woman sitting on a kitchen counter tasting his broth and asking what they were eating like she had always been there. Back in Atlanta, Soleil came home on a Thursday evening to an apartment that answered her with silence. She called his name once, then stood still and listened to the quiet. She checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen. Everything was in place except him. His clothes were gone from the closet. Not all of them, just enough. The kind of taking that said this was not an accident. She found the bracelet on the kitchen counter. A jade piece he had given her months ago. Something old. Something from his family that he had placed on her wrist one night without much explanation except to say it mattered to him. She picked it up and stood there with her coat still on and her bag still on her shoulder and looked at it for a long time. She did not cry immediately. She sat down on the kitchen floor, bracelet in her palm, coat still buttoned, and she sat there in the silence and understood that something had ended. She just did not know why. And not knowing why was the part that would take the longest to forgive. She called Nadia at 9 that night. Nadia arrived 40 minutes later with food she picked up from the place Soleil liked and a look on her face that said she was ready to be whatever was needed. No questions first. Soleil opened the door and said, "He's gone." Nadia came in, put the food down, sat next to her on the floor and said, "Okay, tell me everything." She found out she was pregnant 3 weeks later. A Tuesday morning, a pharmacy 2 blocks from her office, a test she almost talked herself out of buying because surely not on top of everything else. She sat in that small bathroom and stared at the result and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite joy and was completely terrifying. She called Nadia from the parking lot. Nadia picked up on the second ring and said, "What's wrong?" Soleil said, "I need you to come somewhere." Nadia said, "I'm already in my car. Where are you?" That was the thing about Nadia. She never made you explain yourself before she moved. She just moved. They sat in Nadia's car in that parking lot for an hour. Soleil talked. Nadia listened. At the end of it, Nadia looked at her and said, very calmly, "You are going to be an incredible mother. And those babies are going to have everything they need. I will personally make sure of that. But right now I need you to eat something because you look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." Soleil laughed. Surprised her, the laugh. It came out before she could stop it. This short, wet sound that was half cry and half genuine amusement. And Nadia handed her a granola bar with the seriousness of a medical professional and said, "Eat." She ate. She never tried to find him after that. She filed for divorce on abandonment grounds, but the papers never reached him. His identity was buried under layers she could not access, and she was not willing to spend her energy digging. She had 2 babies to prepare for and a career to hold together and a mother who cried when she heard the news and then immediately started knitting because she needed to do something with her hands. The twins arrived in March. 2 boys. She named the first one Kai because it was strong and clean and felt like something that belonged to her. She named the second one June and told herself it was just a name she liked, which was almost true. Almost. Kai was loud from the first hour. He entered the world announcing himself and never really stopped. June was quiet, watchful, the kind of baby who looked at you like he was cataloging information. Nadia said he was going to be trouble in a very specific intellectual way. Soleil looked at him sometimes and saw something that made her chest ache in a direction she did not let herself follow for too long. She made partner at 31. Youngest in the firm's history. She bought the house 6 months after that, and her mother moved into the guest room because the twins were a full-time operation and Soleil was not too proud to accept help from the person who loved her most. Life settled. Not the life she had imagined, but a real one. A good one. Her mornings were loud and her evenings were long, and some nights after the boys were asleep, she would sit on the couch with a glass of wine she only got halfway through and feel the particular quiet of a house where everything was fine and something was still missing. She did not dwell on it. She had never been a woman who dwelled. She just noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room, and then she got up and went to bed. She had been doing exactly that for 3 years when her assistant sent over a new client brief on a Monday morning and the case turned out to be international, high-profile, and based in Seoul. Her mother said, "I have always wanted to see Seoul." Nadia said, "Take her. Take the boys. It'll be good for you." Soleil booked 4 tickets and told herself it was just a case. She had no way of knowing that Min-Jun Kwan's name was all over the city she was flying into, or that his organization touched the very industry her client was tangled in, or that on the day she arrived, he would be hours away from proposing to another woman. She had no way of knowing any of that, but she was about to find out. Seoul was beautiful and cold and moved at a speed that felt like the city had somewhere important to be at all times. Soleil stepped out of Incheon Airport with her mother beside her and Kai on her hip and June holding her hand, and for a moment she just stood there and let the air hit her face and thought, Okay, I can do this. Her mother looked around with wide, delighted eyes and said, "It's so clean. Why is it so clean?" Soleil said, "Mama, please." Her mother said, "I'm just observing," and took June's other hand and walked ahead like she had been to Seoul 20 times before. The hotel was a Grand Hyatt, all marble and light and the kind of quiet that money buys. Soleil's client had arranged it. The lobby was enormous, the kind of space that made you aware of how you were walking, and Soleil walked through it the way she always walked into rooms that were designed to impress people, which was like she had already seen better and was simply passing through. She had a meeting in 40 minutes. She was scrolling through her case notes on her phone while her mother managed the twins, mentally running through her opening points, when she felt something shift in the room. She could not explain it. It was not a sound or a movement. It was more like pressure. The way the air in a room changes when something important enters it. She had felt it once before, in a courthouse waiting room in Atlanta, and her body remembered it before her mind did. She looked up. He was across the lobby. Min-Jun Kwan was walking toward the elevator bank in a dark suit with Do-hyun half a step behind him and 2 other men flanking them, and he had not seen her yet. He was looking at his phone, jaw set, moving with that particular unhurried authority that she had once found infuriating and then found irresistible and then spent 3 years trying to forget. For exactly 3 seconds Soleil forgot every single thing she had built. The partnership, the house, the mornings. All of it went quiet and she was 28 again, standing in a waiting room thinking, "Who is this man and why is he looking at me like that?" Then Kai tugged her sleeve and said loudly, "Mama, I'm hungry." And she came back to herself all at once. She turned to redirect her mother and get them moving toward the elevator and away, and she was almost there. She was so close when Kai tugged again and she hesitated for half a second, and that half second was enough. She heard the footsteps behind her slow. She felt it. She turned around because not turning around would have been worse, and Min-Jun was standing 15 feet away and he was completely, utterly still. He was looking at her. Then he looked down. Kai on her hip. June at her side. Both of them looking back at him with his own eyes sitting inside her face, and he looked like a man who had just understood something that rearranged everything he thought he knew. His men kept walking for 3 steps before they realized he had stopped. Do-hyun turned around and looked at his boss and then looked at Soleil and then looked at the twins, and his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes moved very quickly. Soleil lifted her chin. She did not smile. She did not speak. She held Kai a little more firmly on her hip, took June's hand a little more firmly in hers, and she walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there with her back straight and her face completely composed until the doors opened, and she stepped inside, and the doors closed. She stared at her reflection in the elevator's mirrored doors. Her mother, who had seen everything, said nothing for 4 floors. Then she said quietly, "Soleil." Soleil said, "I know." Her mother said, "Was that?" "Yes." Another 2 floors of silence. Her mother said, "He saw them." Soleil said, "I know, Mama." Her mother looked at her for a long moment with the specific expression of a woman who had a great deal to say and was choosing, with tremendous effort, to say none of it right now. She put her hand over Soleil's hand and held it and said nothing else. Downstairs, Minjun had not moved. Do-hyun stepped close and said, very quietly, "Should I find out who she is?" Minjun said, "I already know who she is." His voice was completely even. "Find out her room number, and get me everything on the timeline." Do-hyun said, "The dinner is in 3 hours." Minjun said nothing. Do-hyun took that as an answer and made the calls. Within 2 hours he had everything. Soleil's full name, her firm, the client she was in Seoul for, the flight she arrived on, the boys' birth certificates pulled through a contact in the U.S. record system. He laid it all out on Minjun's hotel room desk in a clean folder and stood back and waited. Minjun sat down and opened it slowly. He looked at the birth certificates for a long time. The dates. The names. He did the math with the stillness of a man who already knew the answer and was simply confirming it. Kai. June. March. 3 years ago. He closed the folder and sat back and stared at the wall. Do-hyun said, very carefully, "The Kwon family is already at the restaurant. Soo-hyun is." "I heard you," Minjun said. Do-hyun waited. Minjun stood up, put on his jacket and said, "Tell them I am delayed." Do-hyun opened his mouth. Minjun looked at him once. Do-hyun closed his mouth and picked up his phone. The corridor on Soleil's floor was quiet when Minjun got there. He stood in front of her door for a moment before he knocked. He was not a man who rehearsed things. He had never needed to. But he stood there for a moment anyway because he understood that whatever he said in the next few minutes was either going to open something or close it permanently, and he needed to be sure he was ready for either outcome. He knocked. There was a pause. Then her voice, flat and unsurprised, came through the door. "I wondered how long that would take. Can I come in?" A longer pause. Then the door opened. She was still in her work clothes. She had taken her heels off, and that was the only concession she had made to the fact that this was not a normal evening. She stepped back from the door but did not wave him in warmly. She simply made space and let him decide what to do with it. He came in. She left the door slightly open. He noticed that and said nothing about it. The room was a standard suite. Her mother was not there, which meant she had arranged that deliberately, which meant she had known he was coming and had made decisions before he arrived. That told him a great deal about where she was. He looked around the room and then looked at her and said, "Where are they?" "Asleep in the next room," she said. "And you are not going in there tonight." "I wasn't going to." "Good." She sat down in the chair near the window and crossed her arms. Not aggressively. Just like someone settling in for something they had already decided to control. He stayed standing. The space between them felt like something with a temperature. He said, "How old?" She said, 2. "Since March." He looked at the floor briefly and then back at her. "Were you ever going to tell me?" And she laughed. Not a warm laugh. A short, precise sound that had very little humor in it. "Was I going to tell you?" She repeated slowly. "Minjun, you were gone. You were just gone. No note, no call. Nothing except a bracelet on a counter like some kind of receipt. What exactly was my plan supposed to look like?" Was I supposed to hire a detective to track down the man who ghosted his own wife, so I could let him know he left something behind? I left to protect you. I know that's what you believe. It's the truth. Maybe, she said. But here is also the truth. I came home to an empty apartment. I sat on that kitchen floor for 2 hours before I could stand up. I found out I was pregnant alone in a pharmacy bathroom, and I cried in a parking lot, and then I went home and figured out how to build a life that didn't include you in it because I had no other choice. She looked at him steadily. So don't tell me you left to protect me like that makes it something other than what it was. He said nothing. She said, You left me, Minjun. The reason matters, but it doesn't change what it felt like. The room was very quiet. From the next room came a small shuffling sound and then silence again. Both of them looked toward the door instinctively. A beat passed. Nothing more came. Minjun looked back at her and said, I know what I did. I am not here to argue about whether it was right. I know it wasn't. He paused. I just need you to know that I never stopped. Not for a single day. I carried... He stopped himself. Looked at the window briefly. Then back at her. There is not a version of the last 3 years where I was okay. I need you to know that. Soleil looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, brief and complicated, and then she folded it away neatly. How is that supposed to help me? She said. Not cruelly. Genuinely. He said, It's not supposed to help you. I just needed to say it. She studied him. This was the thing about Minjun that had undone her in the first place. He never performed. He never gave you the speech he thought you wanted. He just said the true thing in the flattest possible voice and left you with nowhere to put your argument. She uncrossed her arms. You have a proposal dinner tonight, she said. I'm not going. That is not my problem. I know. She stood up. You should leave. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her the way he used to look at her when he was memorizing something quiet and thorough, like he was making sure he had it exactly right in case he needed it later. Then he said, Good night, Soleil. And she said, Good night, Minjun. And he left. She closed the door and stood with her hand on it for a moment and then walked to the window and looked out at Seoul lit up and glittering below her and thought about the fact that 3 years of carefully constructed distance had just collapsed in the lobby of a hotel in a city she had no business being in. Her phone buzzed. Nadia. A voice note. She pressed play and Nadia's voice came through, cheerful and completely unaware. Hey, just checking in. How's Seoul? Are you eating? Tell your mom to stop feeding the babies sugar after 6. Love you. Soleil stared at the skyline. Then she typed back, I saw him. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then Nadia's response, What? Soleil almost smiled. She put the phone face down on the windowsill and looked out at the city and breathed. And somewhere across Seoul, a table of Kwan family members sat in a restaurant in front of an empty chair and said nothing out loud about what it meant. If you are still watching, drop a comment right now because this story is just getting started and I promise you the best is still coming. Like this video if you are feeling every single second of this. The next morning came quietly. Soleil was up before the twins, which was rare, sitting at the small desk by the window with coffee she had made from the room's machine and a case file she was not really reading. Seoul was gray and soft outside the glass, the kind of morning that felt like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. Her mother knocked and came in at 7 with June on her hip and Kai walking ahead of her with the focused energy of a child who had already decided today was going to be physically exhausting for everyone around him. Her mother looked at Soleil's face and then looked at the untouched coffee and said nothing. Just set June down and let him toddle to his mother, and Soleil picked him up and held him a little longer than usual, and her mother went to make herself tea and gave her the moment. Kai climbed onto the bed and started jumping. Some things, at least, were consistent. Later that morning she went to her client meeting and was sharp and focused and completely professional and did not think about Minjun at all, which was only partially true but was what she told herself. Her client, a cautious man in his 50s named Thomas, kept apologizing for the complexity of the case, and she kept reassuring him with the calm efficiency that had made her partner, and that she wore like armor when everything underneath it was doing something else entirely. She was back at the hotel by 2. Her mother had taken the boys to a small park nearby, and the suite was quiet. She changed out of her work clothes and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for exactly 5 minutes, to feel the full weight of the previous night. She thought about his face in the lobby, the way he had gone completely still. She had imagined that moment sometimes in the early days when she was still angry enough to want him to feel something. She had imagined telling him about the boys and watching his face change. She had never imagined it would feel the way it actually felt, which was not satisfying at all, which was just sad in a very quiet and complicated way. Her phone rang. It was Nadia. She picked up and Nadia said, without any introduction, "Okay, I have been thinking about this since last night, and I need you to talk to me. How did he look?" Soleil said, "Nadia, I'm serious. How did he look?" A pause. Then honestly, because it was Nadia and there was no point in anything else, she said, "He looked exactly the same." Nadia made a sound. "Of course he did. Of course. And he saw the boys." "Yes. And he came to the room." Nadia was quiet for 2 full seconds, which was unusual for her. Then, "He came to the room. Last night." "Yes. And what did he say?" Soleil pulled her knees up and leaned back against the headboard. "He said he left to protect me. He said he never stopped. He said," she paused. "He said there was no version of the last 3 years where he was okay." Nadia was quiet again. Soleil said, "Don't." Nadia said, "I didn't say anything. You were about to say something." "I was going to say," Nadia said carefully, "that the man clearly still loves you. I was also going to say that love does not automatically fix 3 years of silence and 2 babies raised alone. Both of those things are true at the same time, and you are allowed to hold both of them." Soleil said nothing. Nadia said, "What do you want, Soleil? Not what makes sense. Not what is logical. What do you actually want?" The question sat in the quiet room for a moment. Soleil said, "I want things to be simple. I want the last 3 years to not have happened the way they happened. I want my boys to have their father, and I want that to not cost me anything." She laughed softly. "But that's not how it works." Nadia said gently, "No, it's not. But some of it might still be possible." They stayed on the phone a little longer, not talking about much, just the comfortable weight of a friendship that had held through everything. When she hung up, she felt steadier. Not resolved, just steadier. A few hours later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it expecting housekeeping and found Minjun standing there in a simpler version of himself. No suit jacket, collar open, looking like a man who had not slept and was not pretending otherwise. He had coffee, 2 cups, the same place she had mentioned once, months into their relationship, in passing, the way you mention things when you are not yet sure what you are building, but you are building something. She stared at the cups. He said, "I remembered." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. They sat at the small table by the window. The coffee was right, exactly right, and she hated that and was grateful for it at the same time. Outside, Seoul had decided to be beautiful today. Pale sun on the glass towers. He said, "I want to tell you something and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She said, "Okay." He told her about the call, about the dinner with his father, about the photograph of her taken in Atlanta the day before he flew back. He told her about the scar, and without making it theatrical, he unbuttoned the side of his shirt and showed her. For inches along his ribs, clean and deliberate. She looked at it and looked away. He told her about the weeks after, every channel he tried to find to reach her, every door that had his father's shadow behind it. He told her about the ring, the simple one, The one he had bought to repropose when he found a way out, which he had been carrying for 3 years because letting go of it felt like letting go of something he was not ready to release. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I believe you." He looked at her. She said, "I believe all of it. And I need you to understand that believing you and being okay are not the same thing. I believe your father threatened me. I believe you were trying to protect me. I also know that somewhere in those 3 years there was a moment, maybe more than one, where you could have found a way. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not safely, but something, a word, anything." She looked at him steadily. "And you didn't. And I had Kai and June alone, and I brought them home alone, and I figured out who I was as a mother alone. And I don't regret any of it. But I need you to know the weight of what alone felt like." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He said, "No, not fully. I won't pretend I do." He paused. "But I want to, if you let me." From the next room came the sound of small feet, and then June appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, the ones with the tiny bears on them, holding his stuffed rabbit and looking at Min-jun with those calm, watchful eyes that already, at 2 years old, had a quality that belonged to someone much older. Min-jun looked at him. June looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then June walked across the room, not to Min-jun, but to Soleil, and climbed into her lap and settled there and continued looking at Min-jun with the placid curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that strangers were supposed to be alarming. Min-jun said quietly, "He's not afraid of anything, is he?" Soleil said, "Never has been. From the first day." Min-jun looked at June for a long time with something on his face that he was not trying to hide and was not quite managing to contain. His jaw moved slightly. His eyes stayed very still. He said almost to himself, "He has your mouth." Soleil said softly, "He has your everything else." The room was very quiet. Then Kai's voice came from the other room at full volume announcing that he was awake and hungry, and where was everybody? And June slid off Soleil's lap and trotted back toward the sound of his brother. And the moment broke open into the ordinary chaos of 2 toddlers who had no interest in the emotional architecture of the adults around them. Soleil looked at Min-jun. He was still looking at the door the boys had disappeared through. She said, "You should go deal with your family." He said, "My family can wait." She said, "Min-jun." He looked at her. She said, "This cannot happen here. Not in a hotel room in Seoul with your father 3 kilometers away and a woman you were supposed to propose to last night. If this is going to be something, it cannot start like this." He was quiet. She said, "Go home. Handle what you need to handle. And if you are serious, actually serious, then you know where I live." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way he agreed to things when he meant them fully. He stood, picked up his jacket, paused at the door and turned around once more. He said, "I'm sorry, Soleil. Not for the right reasons or the easy reasons. Just sorry. For all of it." She said, "I know." He left. She sat at that table for a long time after. The coffee had gone cold. Outside Seoul moved and glittered and carried on, entirely unbothered. From the next room Kai was narrating something elaborate to June, who was probably not listening, and her mother's voice came through gentle and warm, managing the morning with the ease of a woman who had managed every morning of Soleil's life. She picked up her coffee cup, put it down, picked it up again. She thought about 3 years. She thought about a kitchen floor and a jade bracelet and a pharmacy parking lot and a house she had bought and a partnership she had earned and 2 boys who were the best thing that had ever happened to her. She thought about a simple ring she had not yet seen but somehow already knew existed. She thought about what Nadia had said. Not what makes sense. What do you actually want? She knew the answer. She had known it for 3 years. She had just been waiting to see if it was safe enough to say out loud. 6 weeks later, Minjun Kwan showed up in Atlanta on a Tuesday morning with coffee from her favorite place and sat on her porch and waited. And when she came outside, he did not have a speech prepared. He just looked at her and said, "I handled it. All of it. And I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am just asking to be here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You can stay for coffee." And he sat down. And that was how it started. Not with a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration. Just coffee on a porch on a Tuesday, and two people deciding slowly and carefully and with full knowledge of how badly it could go to try anyway. Her mother met him 3 days later at the kitchen table and ran what Nadia later described as the most thorough informal interrogation in recorded history. She asked about his family, his intentions, his finances, his faith, his cooking, his plans, and at one point asked him directly what he thought his greatest flaw was. Minjun answered every question without flinching, and at the end of it her mother stood up and said she was going to make tea and asked if he wanted some, which Soleil knew from a lifetime of experience was her mother's version of approval. Nadia took 3 months. She was polite immediately and warm eventually and fully herself about it the entire time, which meant she told him exactly what she thought of the situation in precise detail, and then, when he sat with all of it and came back anyway, she decided he had earned a little grace. The boys took to him the way children take to people who get down on the floor with them. Kai immediately tried to use him as a climbing structure. June watched him for 2 weeks and then one evening brought him a book and climbed into the chair next to him and said, "Read." And Minjun read to him for 40 minutes and did all the voices, and Soleil stood in the kitchen doorway watching and felt something in her chest unlock so quietly she almost missed it. He came every week. Then more than once a week. He learned the boys' rhythms, who needed quiet and who needed noise, who ate without argument and who had strong opinions about the color of their cup. He sat at her kitchen table and did work calls in the early mornings and made breakfast without being asked and never once acted like he was doing her a favor by being present. He was restructuring the organization quietly. His lawyers were involved. It was slow and complex and not without danger, and he told her honestly that it would take time, but he was doing it, and the reason he was doing it was sitting in the next room arguing about a toy train. One evening about 6 months in, Soleil was looking for her car keys in a jacket he had left on the back of a chair. Her hand closed around something in the inside pocket. She pulled it out. The ring. Simple gold band. Worn slightly at the edges from 3 years of being carried. The afternoon stretched on. Cake was eaten. Kai crashed gloriously around 3 o'clock and was asleep on the couch within minutes. June sat in Soleil's mother's lap and ate, icing off a plastic spoon with the methodical satisfaction of someone who had achieved exactly what they came for. Minjun helped clean up without being asked, which her mother observed and filed away with a small nod that she thought nobody noticed. At the end of the evening, when the yard was quiet and the boys were bathed and down and Nadia had gone home after a hug that lasted a long time, Soleil stood at the kitchen counter with a last half glass of wine and Minjun was by the door putting on his jacket, and she said, "Minjun." He looked up. She said, "Thank you. For today." He said, "Thank you for letting me be here." She nodded once. He nodded once. He opened the door. Then she said, "The ring is in the drawer by the sink." He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. She could see the back of his neck and the set of his shoulders, and she watched him very carefully process what she had just said. Then he turned around and looked at her. She looked back at him, completely steady, wine glass in hand, leaning against the counter of the home she had built, in the life she had built, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had survived. She said, "I'm not saying yes tonight." He said, "I know." She said, "But I'm not saying no either." He looked at her for a long moment with everything he felt sitting plainly on his face. Not hidden, not managed, just there. And she let herself look back at him with the same honesty, and it was terrifying, and it was right, and it was the most like herself she had felt in 3 years. He said softly, "I'll ask you properly." She said, "I know you will." He left. She heard the front door close quietly. She stood in her kitchen in the silence of a house with sleeping children and a life she had built from the ground up and a ring in the drawer by the sink. She finished her wine. She did not open the drawer. But she did not move it either. And somewhere across the city, Minjun Kwan drove home in the quiet and for the first time in 3 years felt something he had almost forgotten was possible, which was hope. Not the desperate kind. Not the bargaining kind. The quiet, steady kind that sits in your chest like something that intends to stay. His phone buzzed. Do-hyun. He picked up and Do-hyun said, "The chairman wants a meeting. Tomorrow morning." The warmth in his chest did not disappear but something moved alongside it. "Careful. Alert," he said. "I'll be there." He hung up. He looked at the road ahead and drove and thought about Soleil standing in her kitchen looking at him like she had finally decided he was worth the risk. He thought about June and Kai asleep in their room. He thought about everything he had restructured and everything he still needed to and everything that was still, if he was honest, not fully safe. And he thought about his father, who had said nothing about the missed proposal, nothing about Seoul, nothing about any of it. Because in the Kwan family, silence was never peace. It was planning. And whatever his father was planning, Minjun was going to need to be ready. Because this time he had something worth protecting. And this time he was not going to walk away from it. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this story. If this had you feeling everything, please give this video a like. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you are not already here because we have more stories just like this one coming every week. And drop a comment below. I want to know, do you think Soleil should say yes? And what do you think Minjun's father is planning? Let me know everything. I will see you in the next one.